What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion video, and this one's going to be a bit interesting because I've already talked a little bit on some of the topics that I'm going to be talking about in this video, mainly just like what role luck plays in the game. I talked about that in my sort of sacking video, and luck is going to be a factor in this game as it is a game that does rely on you drawing random cards from your deck, so there will be some element of luck there. But what I want to talk about in this video is when looking at results from a tournament, for instance, uh, and looking at some of the more obscure or underrepresented decks that are topping in those sorts of things, just sort of interpreting those results and sort of looking at it through a filter of, is this deck in the top cut because, it's actually a really good deck in the format? Or is it in the top cut because, it fills some niche in the meta? Or is it in the top cut because, the pilot got lucky? And I'm not trying to say that anyone who tops these tournaments got there only because of luck. You need a certain amount of skill to top in any of these formats. And I think, especially playing decks that are sort of not the meta picks, I think you do need a lot of skill in piloting those as they have different demands on you than other more standard decks would. And also, you need to know your decks more sort of inside and out in order to play them optimally and actually pilot them to a finish. So I'm not trying to say that anyone who topped with these decks, just did it through luck. But I think when looking at results from a tournament and sort of deciding, okay, I'm new to this format, I want to play a deck in it, or I want to know what the good decks are in it, I think it is good to look at it through a pretty critical lens and sort of think like, is this deck actually one of the top decks in the format? Or was there some degree in luck here? And the main example that I want to point out is the Dragons deck in Yugi Kaiba. Now, the Dragons deck has topped a couple of tournaments in the past, and there's been some really good duelists playing that deck. However, the Dragons deck is basically dependent on drawing Lord of D, Flute Summoning Dragon, and also a big dragon in hand, and also dependent on your opponent not having things like Waboku, then a follow-up Raigeki or something to clear your board away. So there are a lot of things that need to go right for the Dragon deck to do well, and I actually think like the deck is not the best deck in the format, even though it's topped a fair number of times. But I mean, maybe it's tier 2, maybe it's rogue, but no matter what, it does need a fair amount of luck to actually succeed. And so, when looking at these decks in this format, I wouldn't necessarily call Dragons like tier 1, even though it has topped. And I think that being able to make that critical judgment and being like, well, okay, Dragons topped an event, but, is it actually good? I think that's a very important thing to do when discussing the format as a whole, because I've seen oftentimes, in Discord discussions and things like that, I've seen people, say, well, is this deck really good? And then someone's been like, well, it topped the tournament, so, it's pretty good. And I don't necessarily think that just topping a tournament is ground for deck being good or bad or something like that. So I think it's good to look at the deck a bit more holistically. Another example that you could mention is the Labyrinthine Turbo Critter deck that actually won in a past Critter event. And I actually think that this was not due to luck on the pilot's part. I mean, to an extent, like all these decks have to get a little bit lucky in order to actually win. But I think that the example of the Labyrinthine Turbo deck is that it filled a niche in the metagame. Solemn Judgment is a very popular card in Critter, and it's a very risky card in Critter, as you have to cut your life points in half whenever you use it. Cannon Soldier is a great punish to that, but most decks only play one copy of Cannon Soldier, as, it's so easily searchable off of Witch and Sangan. Labyrinthine Turbo deck was playing 3 copies of Sangan, or 3 copies of Cannon Soldier. You can't play 3 copies of Sangan in Critter because it's semi-limited, but it was playing 3 copies of Cannon Soldier, and that gave it a lot more explosive power in dealing that last bit of burn damage, which is especially necessary when Solemn Judgment was so prevalent. And I think that, looking at this deck, again, you could say that it got lucky to an extent, and I do think that it probably did. But I also think that with the Labyrinthine Turbo deck, what separates it from the Dragon deck is that, it wasn't entirely sort of luck-based to get its victories. I think that, I mean, again, I put that wrong. I don't want to imply that people piloting the Dragon deck are just luck-sacking their opponent, because that's not true. There are many games where, they skillfully win. But in order to pull off what the deck is trying to do, I think that the Labyrinthine Turbo deck is a bit more, it makes a bit more sense why it topped. And, that top could be more repeatable, I think, because it fills that niche. Of course, the Critter metagame might respond to that and thus not play as many Solemn Judgments and the like. And so the Labyrinthine Turbo deck might get a little bit worse. But I do think that it illustrated a key feature of Critter format that, Cannon Soldier is an insanely good card and should maybe be played at more copies in regular decks. The last deck that I want to mention here is Gravekeepers. Now, I think the Gravekeepers actually is a bit different from the Labyrinthine Turbo deck and the Blue Eyes deck in that it's a completely new deck in Yada format, or not completely new, but in terms of topping, I think this is its first top. It actually managed to win the last Yada format tournament that we held. And I do think that this deck is really, really good, and it's really, really skill intensive. I think that this deck probably requires the least amount of luck of any other deck on this list. And it's just a very, very skillful deck, very controlling deck. You need to know when to play your cards at the right times. And of course, there are bricks. So, there is a degree of luck in not just drawing those bricks. Like Necro Valley can be kind of rough if you don't have any monsters and stuff. Just drawing Necro Valley off the top doesn't really do much. But I still think it is a very skill-intensive deck. So looking at Gravekeepers topping in a tournament and winning that tournament, I think that that is a testament to the deck as well as the skill of the player who piloted it. And that's another thing, too, when looking at the decks that actually top. Something like Gravekeepers is probably not a good pick for a newcomer to Yada format to just pick up and run with, because they're like, oh, this won the tournament, so it's the best deck in the format. I think that certain decks do require a certain level of skill to actually pilot well and to actually reach their full potential. So that's another thing to potentially consider. Maybe that'll be the discussion topic of a later video, whether, the difficulty of a deck should actually factor into its ranking in a format, whether that should affect whether a deck is like tier 1, tier 2, or etc. So that's basically what I wanted to say about this. I mainly made this video because I've seen some discussions where people are just basing like a deck's being good or not based on whether it tops or not. And I think that when discussing whether decks are good, you can use tops as like a data point, but you should also, back that up with some, things about the deck itself that actually makes it good in the metagame of a given format. And I think that doing that will enable people to see a clear picture of the entire meta of that format as a whole. But anyways, that's what I wanted to talk about. I look forward to discussing it with you in the comments down below, because I think this is a really nuanced topic and there is a lot of different opinions on this sort of thing. Just like with many other facets of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game, there are many, many interpretations of this. So I really want to hear your thoughts about this down below. Also, if you enjoyed this sort of discussion video, please be sure to subscribe. I release these occasionally, although the main content on my channel is just sort of showing off retro Yu-Gi-Oh gameplay. So, if you enjoy that, definitely subscribe as well for that. But yeah, we're almost at 900 subs, and that'd be really nice to reach by the end of October. And also, if you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like. It really helps out the channel quite a bit. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.